Good afternoon. It is great to see everyone and welcome to the third of our four series. Next week is our last week. We're taking off around the time of Memorial Day for a 4-week session with Paul Liptz. He is one of the greatest teachers of teachers in Israel. There are many, including many associated with Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, whose first teachings in the land of Israel happen with Paul. And so we're thrilled to have him again. His topic today, for me, is personal. Yitzhak Rabin is, I would say, my hero on multiple levels. I just talked about him yesterday at confirmation. I have stamps that are related to our topic today. There was a stamp that was issued after his death that I have that hangs over my desk. When I lived in Israel in the 90s, you could walk by the prime minister's residence in Jerusalem and walk right up. In fact, one night, the whole cabinet was there having dinner, and one by one, after each Shulamit Aloni and Perez and all the cabinet members came out. It was a big night because he didn't like to be in Jerusalem. He liked Tel Aviv much more. So ultimately, the place of his death. But it was very accessible. Today it's different. The whole street is blocked off, not even just in front of the house. And why Yitzhak Rabin is my hero is because whatever his nation needed him to be at the time when he was young, he wanted to be in agriculture. He wanted to be a farmer, and he gave 100% to being a farmer. He went to Kadori Agricultural School. When his nation needed him to be a warrior, he became a warrior, was head of the Israeli army. And when his nation needed to be a peacemaker, which also ultimately led to his death, he was 100% into that. And he's just a hero of a person. And I met him once at a rabbi's convention. I think it was a rabbinical student. He met him. He walked by. He was also, I think, Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, the first prime minister that was born in like the land. It was still British Mandate Palestine when he was born, but he was born there. And I just found out recently, actually, that my family is from the same area of Europe that his family is from, and I'm hoping one day to find a connection with that. So with no further ado, I'm happy to welcome Paul Liptz for our third session.
Good afternoon to everyone. So as your rabbi pointed out, Yitzhak Rabin is a very interesting fellow. Unfortunately, the days of walking by the prime minister's house and meeting someone, which actually happened to me with Abba Eban, a former foreign minister who was walking in the same area, those days changed. And in some senses, this PowerPoint, this presentation today, will be the crucial event where the idea that politicians could freely walk around actually changed. So this is a series of Israeli protest movements, and here we have protests of two very different kinds. Those who opposed the Oslo Accords and those who were in favor of it. And I'll obviously concentrate to a large extent on the central character of that whole event, who is the Yitzhak Rabin. Whoopsies, I've got a lock here. Okay, I'll do it this one. Sorry about that. So as was mentioned, very much an Israeli leader, agricultural high school, never got a degree, by the way. He is an extremely alert and well-informed person, but life was too busy to go to study at university. And for those who remember him very positively, it was because he was very central in the Palmach, the leftist underground movement. But in 1948, with the Alta Lena case, he became a different kind of figure in the minds of many people. Just to remind us what the Alta Lena was. The Alta Lena was a boat which brought arms and ammunition for the right-wing underground movements, the Irgun and the Lehi groups. And there was an actual battle on the beach of Tel Aviv, where the man who then became the Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, felt that there was such a danger of the various Jewish militias fighting each other that it had to actually come under the control of the Israel Defense Forces, which had already been established, and therefore there was this very problematic event. This was going to be remembered and repeated many times afterwards. Rabin, interestingly enough, is a conflicting kind of figure in terms of, is he always left or right? And you'll see the kind of contradictions coming up. In the January 1949 talks, which was at the end of Israel's War of Independence, in the island of Rhodes, not too far from Israel, he actually objected to a compromise with Egypt. So he had within him a kind of a strange hard line approach. And yet, as was mentioned at a later time in history, he would be the one who very much wanted to develop peace talks. He was the chief of staff 1964-1968. And in fact, although Moshe Dayan is remembered as the leader of the Israeli army, so to speak, Minister of Defense in the Six-Day War of 1967, the whole planning came under Yitzhak Rabin's auspices as chief of staff. He's often remembered for his famous speech from Mount Scopus in June the 28th, 1967, just at the end of the Six-Day War. And just to read the little section in red, the idea of the war and the role of soldiers is to ensure the existence of our people to its homeland, to live in its own state, free, independent, and peaceful. And the whole speech itself is actually, I've used it often in education, is a kind of different analysis, different approach to what some people understand Israel to be. This is really a kind of a leftist nationalist perspective of what Israel should be. He was a successful ambassador between 1968 and 1973. And people who got to know him as ambassador in the States, and I've met several, would often say about him something which I think is very different from the, let's call it the Bill Clinton kind of personality. He would walk into a room as if he was just absolutely anyone. It was known that he'd go into the kitchen to speak to the kitchen staff. Very, very casual. He never really saw himself as anyone but just a regular human being. But when it came to politics, we'll see that he either in 1949 didn't want to compromise with the Egyptians, but when it came to another realm of politics, we see that he had a very different point of view. I mention this because this will be very important when we get to the period of the assassination. During his first premier period, 1974 to 77, by the way, he wasn't a very impressive prime minister, at least the first time round. He wasn't a political person. That really wasn't his strong point. He got into power essentially because the Labour Party was running out of suitable people. And after Golda Meir, then they were looking very quickly for someone to take her place. She had resigned, and they wanted someone who had some sort of national appeal. And having been involved in the Six-Day War, obviously he was a good candidate. Then he made a very important statement about what he understands about the territories. And he stated in a very important speech, the bulk of the West Bank must not be kept by Israel and certainly not settled by it. Well, we can imagine that term now is very much part of the wider controversy in the country. During his first premiership, he moved into different roles. The 1973 Yom Kippur War, with all its problematics, which I dealt with last week, moved Israel in a new direction, which at a later stage, Prime Minister Menachem Begin was going to take advantage of. And that was, there were interim agreements with Egypt and Syria. Now, these interim agreements were military agreements, military people meeting each other. And it's often been said that the best way to get warring members, warring countries to actually interact with each other is not to go through the political realm, but rather to go through the military realm. And he was involved in that particular one. He then was caught in an event which was very strange, and that was that he had permitted certain F-15 flights to come to Israel on Shabbat, which it's not even clear if he was fully aware of it or not. And then there was on that basis, there was the right-wing ultra-Orthodox Agudat Yisrael party had a no confidence vote. But the real reason that he resigned was because he had a dollar bank account, which while he was ambassador, he actually hadn't closed it. Had he closed it, that would have been acceptable. But at that stage, Israel had very, very strict laws in terms of where you had your money around the world. And he felt on an issue that many Israelis wondered, it wasn't a massive amount of money which had been in the American bank. He felt that as prime minister, he had to be a better citizen than others, and therefore he resigned. He was out of politics just a little bit until later he became defense minister. And then he made a very, very strong comment in his memoirs. He was being out of office. He wrote his memoirs. And this was a very strong statement, which once again in later history would be well recorded. He speaks here about Gush Emunim, the activist movement which supported the right wing. I see in Gush Emunim one of the greatest threats to the state of Israel. It is not a settlement movement. It is a cancer in Israel's social and domestic fabric, a manifestation of an entity that takes the law into its own hands. Well, the reason why this particular comment caused such controversy is that for those Israelis, and it's a considerable percentage of the citizenship of this country, the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, are an integral part of the state of Israel. These are the holy areas. Many people of that political point of view would say, really, Tel Aviv has no biblical importance at all. That really isn't what we're all about. What we really need is the Judea and Samaria area, where there is a very large Palestinian population. So this was really, in a way which I don't think anyone would have imagined, that some of these comments would become so important in a later stage, but he had written it down and that would be there. In between 1984 and 1990, he became defense minister. Interesting, with very different political views. Menachem Begin recognized him as a capable person, and unlike what happens in almost every other ministry that I'm aware of, and I've been studying Israeli politics for a long time now, Menachem Begin and Shimon Peres, members from the right-wing Likud party, brought him in as defense minister, recognizing his talents and not so concerned with his political views in terms of the territories. He was involved in the first Intifada in 1987, and in a very problematic comment, he spoke about breaking the bones of the Palestinians. There's once again, like so many things, it is claimed that he himself, what he was really talking about, don't kill these people, rather, use batons, but certainly don't kill them. But he is actually remembered very much for the break their bones comment. In October 1991, he began to see and recognize that there was some way of moving ahead. The Madrid Conference, which is pretty much forgotten in Israeli history, was actually quite an important event because it was under Yitzhak Shamir, a colleague of Menachem Begin, and it brought together people from Arab countries, the Palestinians and Israel. Now, with the Palestinians, there was an intermediary way of dealing with it, because at that time, Israel was not prepared to negotiate face-to-face with the Palestinians. And so they came in under a joint Palestinian delegation, which really was just a way of working out how to get everyone into the room. But this is 1991, October 1991. There is already kind of a feeling that somehow or other the intransigent Middle East might be able to move in a new direction. Then he came in as a second period as prime minister, starting in 1992. And this was really a very different kind of period. He came in and almost immediately, the government found itself in a new kind of mode. The initiator of the peace process was actually not Yitzhak Rabin, but rather Shimon Peres. Shimon Peres was defined as a dreamer, not so much a pragmatist, very capable person, a very clear understanding of the wider world. And the early stages of what became the Oslo Accords actually started in 1992. There were three people who were initially involved: Yossi Beilin, Yair Herschel, a very close personal friend of mine, who was actually useful for me because as the early stages of the talks were going on, he would always sort of whisper to me some sort of concept of where we were going and where we weren't going. And the third person was Ron Pundak, who unfortunately passed away some years ago. After Shimon Peres had got the Oslo process slightly moving, he then reported to Yitzhak Rabin. Rabin looked at it. He found it an unusual idea. Here, instead of dealing with the nation states around us, there would be an attempt to deal with the Palestinian issue. Now, he had been very influenced by an early event, and that was the Intifada of 1987, where going through the Palestinian parts of the country, he felt that it was an absolute impossible situation where Israel would find itself ruling over, at that time, 2.5 million Palestinians. Now it's at least another 500,000 higher than that. He was also clearly influenced by the 1979 Camp David Agreement between Israel and Egypt. And once again, his ability to work with Menachem Begin and Menachem Begin's ability to work with him, although they had different political views, I think was a very important stage of Israeli politics where so much of it is intense anger. You have a sense that it's a politics of anger in this country that seems to be deeply embedded into our society. Here we had people with different points of view, recognizing the talents of the other. And then, so this early stage brought about Oslo I. It was the Oslo Accords were actually two stages. Oslo I was called Gaza, Jericho Now. And it was a very early stage. It was signed in Cairo in May 1994. A personal comment about Oslo I. At that particular time, I was in the education unit of the Israeli army in the reserves. And I got a late night call where the person in charge of the education unit, which dealt mainly with officers, asked me, or in the Israeli army, they ask you, but they tell you, essentially, that 5 of us would be asked to go to the officer training center, not far from the center of Jerusalem, and to explain to army officers what the Oslo Accords about. Now, we hadn't heard of it. So it was quite a shock the next morning. We went up to the center. There were 5 of us, people who I'd worked with in various stages in the reserves. And we were asked to explain to the officers what this very unclear document was all about. We won't go into the details of it, but basically to say it was from all our perspective, from the 5 of us who read this document for the first time before it was actually published in public, was that we didn't quite understand it. The reason was that the Oslo Accords were not really an agreement. They were kind of a work in process. It was the underlying thesis of Oslo was that because the Israeli-Palestinian issue was at a certain stage perceived as an intractable situations where you just can't get out of it. The idea of the Oslo Accords was slowly but surely you'll develop trust. That was really what the whole thing was about. In between the various stages of Oslo, there was the 1994 peace treaty with Jordan, which really sort of set an atmosphere in the country that we were moving towards peace. Later on that year, in December 1994, Rabin, Peres, and Arafat would be granted the Nobel Peace Prize. The comment, his speech when he received the prize, is really a kind of a very interesting one, out of character in many senses from the way that most Israeli leaders would actually speak. So I'd like to quote it. At the tender age of 16, I was handed a rifle so that I could defend myself, and also, unfortunately, so that I could kill in an hour of danger. That was not my dream. We will prevail because we regard the building of peace as a great blessing for us and for our children after us. I am the emissary of the poets and of those who dreamed of an end to war, like the prophet Isaiah. So this, you can see, it's an interesting change from what you would normally expect from a military person. This led a little later to what became the final Oslo Accord, so-called Oslo II, which divided up the area, the West Bank, Judean Samaria, into 3 particular regions. By the way, as someone who then had to explain to officers and soldiers at later stages in the army what this was, it was very confusing. It seemed to be a mishmash, a kind of a complex way of trying to understand how things would be. Area A would be under full Palestinian control, areas B would be under Israeli and Palestinian control, and area C would be under Israeli control over. The map, which I've used on so many occasions, when I would pull it out and show the audiences, they would say, "What's that?" That just didn't seem to be any way of understanding what was going on. But basically, as I mentioned, this was going to be part of a process. The Knesset ratified Oslo II. That means the majority of the political forum of Israeli society agreed that this was what the state wanted. There was a great deal of opposition to it, even within the Knesset. There were very, very harsh discussions going on. But Rabin defined Oslo not as an agreement as we would normally understand it, but he put it in a different sense. By the way, this speech was very useful for us because we were in our work in the Israeli army constantly trying to understand what we should be saying. We weren't given instructions. In the Israeli Army Education Unit, no one ever told us what we should say or how we should say it. But we were obviously trying to understand government decisions as best as we could. Then he, in this particular speech in the Knesset, made a clear statement of what it should be. We want this entity to be less than a state that will manage independently the lives of the Palestinians under its authority. We will not return to the lines of June 4th, 1967. So we can see that while it was never clear at an earlier stage, I think he was certainly trying to be practical in the political sense and saying to the opposition, who was so much against any kind of agreement with the Palestinians, look, it's not going to be a full state, although many people who afterwards analyzed Rabin's way of thinking believed that this comment would be less than a state was only a stage of what would perhaps eventually be a full state. The initial result for Israel was extremely important. Within a very short period of time, in 1995, we had diplomatic relations with 150 countries, countries which had not wanted to sign any agreements with us, or wanted at most a very low level of diplomatic interaction, established high-level diplomacy, and as a result of that, the Israeli economy boomed. So at a certain moment in 1965, for those of us who agreed with the Oslo Accords, there seemed to be advantages to it, certainly in terms of the diplomatic and economic realms. But the opposition was tremendous. And here we come to the reality of what was going on the streets. I've chosen just 3 pictures of many, many, which appeared on the in the wider realm. This one lower at the picture, which was defined Rabin as the ultra right-wing extremist. It was a very strange kind of way, which actually saw him as a Nazi, as an SS officer. So here, this idea that he had gone through a diplomatic process to get in the Knesset, this had absolutely no value. The other picture is absolutely horrendous in terms of what actually happened. Haboged, the traitor, with a rifle range here, and you can see the central bullet would go right into him. Then, once again, of just a few of the many pictures, were that Rabin in a kafia, in an Arab Palestinian head covering, and Yasser Arafat, they are blood brothers. And then all the various comments going on, describing him very much in the sense of a traitor. Rabin, in this particular situation, in terms of ongoing protests and demonstration in the country, was very much the traitor. By the way, this woman belonged to an organization called Women in Green, which was the opposition to the left-wing women's organization of the time called Women in Black. Now, the position for Rabin was very complex. Unfortunately, and it's not the first time in Israeli history, that when we seem to be moving forward in one way or the other, the radical Palestinian groups become very active, in a sense, trying to prevent from the Palestinian side moving forward to an agreement, just as on the Israeli side, there were those forces which tried to stop moving forward as well. The words, the language in Israel at that time were absolutely frightening. I can remember it so very, very clearly, albeit some 26 years ago or so, 28 years ago. I can remember very much the commentary of what this actually meant, what these kind of protests meant. And one of the more central Middle East experts, Professor Harkabi, who had a very important career in Israel, he made a comment at the end of 1994, Rabin will not die a natural death. The country will be affected by a terrible shock. And these comments were coming out every now and again, but it was a different points of view, very deep tension and division within Israeli society. But we find even in November 1995, French Jewish journalist says the following: the stage has been prepared for Rabin's assassination, and an actual attempt is just a question of time. By the way, I must tell you that comment comes up again and again in Israeli politics. When things seem to become so very tense, once again, the idea is, people would say in a political speech, when one side or the other side is perceived to be too radical, that be careful, this will not be the first stage of a major disaster. The interesting thing was that Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, the Sephardi chief rabbi at the time, said it was actually permissible to give up parts of the land of Israel. So that was perceived to be a very important issue, but the political party of whom he was the religious head, Shas, they opposed it. Now, one can understand the feeling of the West Bank Israelis, the West Bank settlers. They had been living there. They had been allowed to go into the West Bank, into Judea and Samaria by the various governments. And for them, this was a total threat to where they were living. So, it really is a situation of competing narratives. If you lived within the Green Line, the pre-67 borders of the state of Israel, well, then what was happening, what Oslo meant, had not a great deal of impact on one's daily life, because there would be some sort of semi-Palestinian state in the West Bank. For those Israelis who were living in the area, obviously the situation was totally different. It was this was the high stakes situation. I often say of Israeli society and Israeli politics that so many things that happen in this country are not just a matter of words, but a matter of where the stakes are so very high. We're obviously seeing it at the moment in terms of what the events of Temple Mount. Two sides, both exactly wanting the exact same little bit of territory. And that's really what the nature of living in the Middle East is all about. Then came the introduction of a new component. Yigal Amir, a law student at Bar Ilan University, the modern Orthodox university in Israel, although a significant number of students are not religious, and there are also a large number of Arab students. Yigal Amir was kind of just one of those so-called regular people. His mother was actually had a kindergarten in the house, and it was kind of one of those people who just a regular students, more or less. But Yigal Amir maintained that Rabin qualified for Din Rodef. I'll mention in the next slide exactly what that was all about. He had become increasingly religious as time went by. He came from a religiously observant family, but sort of a mainstream family. As time went by and he got into further studies, he increasingly looked at the Bavli, at the Babylonian Talmud, and the writings of Rambam, of Maimonides, and extrapolating from the comments that we find there, and we all know that you can take religious sources in different ways, you can understand it in different contexts. He was clearly being influenced by his interpretation of the Talmud and Maimonides. Now, what do we hear about him? What do we know about him? Because a tremendous amount of analysis afterwards about who this particular person was. And one of the commentaries of him was the following. Yigal Amir was neither a freak nor a misfit, but a young man of discipline and multiple gifts who thrived in the nation's mainstream. Very interesting comment. Students called him the Yemenite genius, and teachers urged him towards the rabbinate. So, religious law student, good background to go into the rabbinate as well. However, we begin to realize what his actual political points of view were as a result of how he responded to the Baruch Goldstein, an American doctor who lived in Hebron, who had picked up a gun in February 1994 and gunned down 29 Muslims in the tomb of the patriarchs and matriarchs. So this was, if Baruch Goldstein was Yigal Amir's hero, then even kind of without putting all the, 1 + 1 gives 2 as part of the thought process, we begin to realize really what he was in his essence. From 1994 onwards, and remember that the Oslo Accords were and the various stages were signed in 1993 and early 1994, we begin to see yet a more concrete opposition to the Oslo peace process, very much always recognizing that Rabin was the center of the feeling. So here the Gush Emunim idea came into the center of it, and this was, there was deep theological discussions where the rabbis maintained that the land of Israel is superior to the state of Israel. The land of Israel is the biblical land of Israel, although it could be different variations. For some people, the land of Israel is the area from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River. And because there were two and a half tribes On the other side, in what is Jordan today, that was also the land of Israel. So the land of Israel definition is go through change. But the general idea of this comment made by the rabbis was that the state of Israel, the Knesset of Israel, the elected sovereign body of Israel, is not to make the decisions, but rather those people who believe in essentially the biblical land of Israel. And the Yesha Council, which was the council of the Gush Emonim and the West Bank people, described that the government as Judenrat, using the very problematic Nazi term. One of the Israeli television programs, Channel 7, used the following term, taking what we've already seen in some of the posters. Rabin is a traitor, murderer, and a drunk. And here in the theological sense came the question of what Din Rodef is about, the law of the pursuer. And it is stated in the Sanhedrin, he who gives away parts of the land of Israel, he who kills him first is rewarded. Now, this is one interpretation of the Sanhedrin. There are obviously very different ideas, but the way that Yigal Amir, and I imagine some of the supporters of the anti-Oslo group, was that the very action of anyone who would ever give back the land of Israel, which essentially means all the territory which Israel had received or taken over, as you want to describe it, in 1967, that person really should be killed. The Kahana Chai, an organization which had been very much influenced by Rabbi Meir Kahana, which until recently was described as a terrorist organization by the United States, but apparently is about to be taken off the international terrorist group by the State Department. The Kahana Chai organized a big demonstration. This became, by the way, a very problematic event in later Israeli political history, where the word Zionism's murderer was connected to a coffin, which looked like a coffin. In the coffin was imagined that was going to be the Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, and Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu, at that time the leader of the opposition, he was actually at that meeting. And he was at that time, and a little later, on October the 5th, 1995, in Zion Square in Jerusalem, a massive crowd, 100,000, by the way. If you know that area of near the Zion Square, downtown Jerusalem, it's a very narrow area, and to put 500,000 people into that small area was very difficult. It means that Jerusalem, which is politically a right-wing part of the country, there were tremendous shouts of death to Rabin. Netanyahu was giving a speech. There was a claim that there were pictures of Rabin in Nazi uniform, and that Netanyahu should have said, we're in a political discussion, please don't use the language. He didn't say it. He afterwards found himself in a difficult position, and he maintains that he hadn't seen all the posters and certainly hadn't heard all the comments. That time, November 4th, 1995, there's a peace rally in Tel Aviv, 100,000 participants. Gigantic. This was a downtown Tel Aviv. You could see the pictures showing this very, very massive audience. It was a peace rally organized by the Peace Now, a leftist organization. And at that particular peace rally, you had the leaders of the Israeli political leadership singing. Here you have Shimon Peres, here you have Yitzhak Rabin. Here Yitzhak Rabin gave a speech. There was then singing important songs, was sung in particular song here about Shira Shalom, the song for peace. This is Yitzhak Rabin singing. Yeah, it wasn't great at singing, but he was certainly in it. This was what it was, the major division between the two blocks. The Jerusalem bloc under Netanyahu's control, or where he was dominating it, and the Oslo Accord bloc, where Yitzhak Rabin was the dominant figure, deeply divided society. His Rabin's last speech was a crucial one. I'll just read some sections. Permit me to say, I too am moved. I wish to thank each and every one of you who has stood up here against violence and for peace. By the way, one has to add that at that particular time, there were real physical actions against some of the political leaders, some of the Labour Party politicians. Their cars were being pushed and attacked. So he says, thank you for all those who stood up against that kind of situation. I was a military man for 27 years. I fought as long as there was no chance for peace. Today, I believe that there is a chance for peace, a good chance. And you here, by showing up for this rally, prove that along with many who did not get here, that the people truly want peace and oppose violence. Violence is eating away at the foundations of Israeli democracy. It must be condemned, denounced, and isolated. Now, by the way, the investigation after the assassination showed that he had been told by the security people that he should wear a vest and drive in an armored car. He refused to do it. With hindsight, we realize that this refusal by him to listen to the words of the security people was a terrible kind of decision he made. The potential civil war concept, which has come up on a few occasions, unfortunately, in Israeli history, was unbelievable. Yigal Amir, after that speech, Rabin walked down. Yigal Amir was waiting for him. He shot him. And then the country went up, some sections absolutely devastated and other sections delighted. For example, after the assassination, Kiryat Arba, which is a Jewish Israeli area right next to Hebron, people celebrated the murder all night. However, and I think this is very important because radical attention so often influences the way we look at whatever's going on in any particular country. I think it's very important to recognize this coming comment, which I think is to make sure that one doesn't exaggerate or really given a point of view which is incorrect. For most religious Jews, Amir's act was unacceptable. But for the majority of fundamentalist religious Jews whom Amir represented, Rabin's murder was absolutely justified. How did the country respond? And the reason why I think it's so important to recognize for most religious Jews, Amir's act was unacceptable, was the fact that there was right through the country national mourning. Literally, the country cried. And there were young religious people meeting, sitting on the roads of various areas, particularly in the area where Rabin had given his final speech in that central part of the municipality of Tel Aviv. And they were sitting and they were in prayer, they were in mourning. So the question, which has been the basis of a tremendous amount of analysis and a great deal of serious writing, really is, was the assassination of Rabin an act of a small fundamentalist religious minority group, or did this represent a broader society? Obviously, as I mentioned a little earlier, the question came up, was Benjamin Netanyahu in any way responsible? By the way, we do know about, when we look at the biographies on Netanyahu, is that he did very much feel that as a result of the assassination of Rabin, that this was in many senses going to be the end of his political career, which obviously did not happen. The funeral of November the 6th was just an absolutely amazing event. Attended by 80 heads of state. Now, this was a kind of from one day to the next kind of event. The whole background to how all these heads of state, and if the head of state couldn't actually get there, certainly another very senior person would be there, was a story in itself. People were in the middle of the meetings. People were flying from one part of the world to the other. They turned the plane around, and this in itself, I think, indicates that the Oslo Accords had attracted the attention of the wider world, even in many cases of Israel's enemies. I obviously won't go through the whole list, but we see that President Clinton arrived here with 35 senior officials. And then, as we can see, from the Netherlands, from Britain, Russia, Spain, Canada, Belgium, Morocco, the Oman. By the way, at that time, we didn't have diplomatic relations with many of these kind of countries. Hosni Mubarak, we had an agreement with the French president, the German chancellor, King Hussein, who signed an agreement with a year earlier. They all turned up. President Clinton, at that particular moment, really did become the center figure. Here we see him listening to a translation from Hebrew into English. His speech was to be much quoted in the later years. It really was a brilliant kind of statement. But I think what's, in a sense, the most important part about Clinton's speech was how he related to the late Yitzhak Rabin. Every moment we shared was a joy, because he was a good man and an inspiration, because he was also a great man. And then he used the expression Shalom Chaver, goodbye friend. And for a number of years afterwards, you would drive around Israel and see on the back window, Shalom Chaver. You would that would almost be a statement. It would obviously describe those people who were deeply distressed by it. King Hussein also made a very important statement. I had never thought that the moment would come like this, when I would grieve the loss of a brother, a colleague, and a friend, a man, a soldier who met us on the opposite side of a divide, whom we respected as he respected us. Now, the speeches are all available on the internet. It really, when I got many years ago involved in trying to analyze public speeches and what they say and how they're said, I must admit the speeches at this particular funeral resonated with me as being particularly powerful. Rabin's granddaughter, Noah, we'll see, here we see, by the way, King Hussein. We'll see a picture of Noah just a little later. Hers was totally the speech of a granddaughter. Noah at that time must have been probably 16 or 17 years old. To the angels of heaven that are accompanying you now, I ask that they watch over you, that they guard you well, because you deserve such a God. We will love you, Grandpa, always. Very powerful, very tragic moment of Israeli history. In a sense, there are no words to really describe what happened and the pain. As we see from the sources, some people anticipated it, some people wanted it, some people saw him as the traitor, but the reality was that if we look at who this man was and what he contributed, a young soldier in the Palmach with Yigal Alon, the head of the Palmach, here Yitzhak Shamir, Rabin is looking over the shoulder of Yadin, discussing the Egyptian Accords. Here's 1967 with Moshe Dayan, Rabin, and Narkis going through the East Jerusalem to the Western Wall. Here he is with his wife. Here it is at that famous speech. And here we see a picture of him with an Israeli flag. Shalom Chaver, that famous statement. Just some of the other pictures. By the way, what's interesting about the whole assassination is that there is a Rabin museum in Tel Aviv, in Ramat Aviv. If you haven't been to it, when you next come to Israel, I would very much recommend that you go to that museum. It's really quite an amazing one, where the idea of the museum is that the life of Yitzhak Rabin is interacted with global events. It's trying to show that Rabin, while a committed Israeli citizen and a nationalist, a Zionist, was also very much involved in the big wide world. Here we have chain smokers, Rabin and King Hussein, Arafat, Peres, and Rabin. Here we have the song that he had sung, and he put the song into his pocket. And when he was shot, the blood was on the song itself. Here we see, as I mentioned earlier, young people, religious and non-religious young people, right around the country, and particularly in the center of Tel Aviv. Very, very powerful. By the way, there was a whole lot of graffiti. There was a book which came out on the graffiti of the wars of the Tel Aviv municipality. Here we find the picture of him and flowers. We find the mourning family, his son, Leah Rabin, Noah, his daughter, and his grandson. Here we see Noah at the time, and this is the gravestone in Jerusalem at Mount Herzl, which many people until today go and visit. The big question, which so many of us ask ourselves, what would have happened if Yitzhak Rabin had lived? As I mentioned, the center exists, just to try and end on the note for the future. It was established in 1997 by the Knesset. It's in a beautiful, beautiful building, and the idea of it is stated on their on the website, whose impact must not be ignored or forgotten lest we risk the recurrence of such shattering events. By the way, for many people, it very much reminds us of the destruction at the Second Temple period, where the idea of wanton hatred, sinat chinam, comes to the fore, where although the end of the Second Temple period is not only because of the conflict between the warring factions, but because of the enemy of the time, the fact that the warring Jewish factions enable the destruction to come about that much easier, very much resonates at the moment. The exhibition has 200 videos, 1,500 photos, and it ends on the lowest floor. Very, very powerful event where I've been there many, many times to the museum. I must admit, you start at the top in that museum and you come down, and I'm kind of always have this very uncomfortable, sad feeling as I get towards ground floor, which is the presentation of the assassination itself. Over to you. Any questions? I'll be happy to try and answer.
I'm sorry, I'm in the car as I told you I'd be, but I've seen the gun. I don't know, Paul, if you ever know, the gun is stored at the National Archives, which is not open to the public, but APAC took us there a few years ago, and the gun and the bullets. And what's so sick about it is the bullets that Yigal Amir used, they're regular bullets, but then there are also these, I don't even know what they're called, like twisty bullets that are meant to maim. It was very clear what the intent was. It's a very eerie, disturbing thing to see.
Actually, I didn't know that it was even around. Thank you very much. I was trying to get to see it. That's amazing. I was unaware that that existed. It's amazing. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, must be very powerful. The symbolic meanings of this particular moment of history are remarkable. Well, you know, I think in Americans having experienced assassinations, sort of, I think, you know, these are the events that wherever you live in any part of the world, assassination of a leader, whether you like the leader or not, is a tragedy.
Absolutely. That was such an absolutely incredible presentation, and so much of that I had no idea about, and this is the first time hearing it, and I can tell you just my world has changed after learning this. Wow. And just the motives and the Netanyahu connection as well with the Likud. I mean, that's sick. That's really just it rings, it like sort of echoes and through what countries go through, especially even our country, what we go through with this sort of getting to people's primal state, like appealing. It's easy, shooting fish in a barrel, these primal things, fear and, you know, nationalism. It's so easy to rouse people in that, but it's so much harder to be dignified and compassionate and balanced. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. Know, over the years, I've always been petrified by radical groups, regardless of whether it's the left or right or religious or non-religious, because it does get out of control. And there's no doubt about it that Yigal Amir by himself, if he lived in a vacuum, I don't think he would have felt that what he was doing was valid. But the wider atmosphere of the people around him really encouraged him. By the way, he's still in jail. It's an amazing story. There's a law in Israel that if you've been in prison for a certain amount of time, you're allowed to have sexual relations with a woman. A Russian woman had relations. They actually have a son. He's still in jail. The woman, his wife, who he married, has a son. I have no idea where they live. But, you know, you just have this other feeling that somehow or other, you know, you wonder what that's all about. So every now and again, they're tough answers to these things.
What kind of a prison system is that? You know, what happened to life in prison? Yeah,
it's a very strange one. You know, there's some sort of legislative issues that one asks questions about. So that's certainly one of them. Yeah, I'm pleased you appreciate it. And I think it's an important event, important part of Israeli society. You know, it's an extreme moment. Fortunately, most times in Israel are not like that. But, you know, one has to understand a society both by its quiet, happy days and by the extreme days as well. That's what countries are all about, essentially, combination of realities.
Wow. So on behalf of Temple Bethel and Rabbi Jessica, myself, thank you so much to Professor Paul Liptz for just blessing us again with such an incredible presentation and teaching. So I hope that you all tune in next week and have a wonderful week, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.